You're settling in now, aren't you? Finding that place where your mind can wander, but still hold on to something real. Welcome to Tales of Vatican Secrets. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. New stories arrive here every single day. And honestly, once you've heard what's coming tonight, you'll want to be here when the next one drops. Before we go any further, I'm curious. Which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? It's late here, that hour when the world feels smaller and older things feel closer. Tonight, we're not chasing shadows or whispers. We're following something concrete, a document that existed, that mattered, and that disappeared from the Vatican archives in 1939, not mysteriously, not dramatically, but deliberately, through systems that were already in place, through mechanisms that had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. You're past the point of casual listening now. If you stay, you'll understand how institutional silence actually works, not through conspiracy, but through classification, through access codes, through the physical architecture of knowledge storage itself. Let's begin. You're standing, in your mind, in the year 1938, and you need to understand something about the Vatican Secret Archives. That's what they were called then, before the 2019 rebranding to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, though the change in name didn't change the structure beneath. The archives occupy a series of interconnected buildings and underground corridors that stretch from the Vatican Library complex toward the Torre dei Venti, the Tower of Winds, and down into storage chambers that were expanded significantly during the pontificate of Leo X, who in 1881 issued the decree that opened portions of the archives to qualified scholars for the first time. But opening doesn't mean transparency. It means controlled access through a system called the consultation request process, which requires researchers to specify exact document references, fondo or archival group plus series plus numerical identifier, before any material is retrieved. You can't browse. You can't discover accidentally. You request what you already know exists, which means you need to know it exists in the first place, which means someone had to catalog it, which means someone decided how it would be described, which means the catalog itself is a form of control more powerful than any locked door. In 1938, the archives held approximately 35,000 volumes in the main inventory alone, not counting uncatalogued material, loose documents bundled in mazzi, sheaves tied with cord, or the separate collections maintained by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the Holy Office, formerly the Roman Inquisition, which kept its own archive with its own access rules that were even more restrictive. Vatican secrets, in the real sense, aren't hidden. They're organized in ways that make them findable only to those who already possess specific knowledge of their location and classification. The document we're concerned with tonight existed in the system. It was cataloged. It had a reference number within the Secretariat of State Archives, specifically within the subsection dealing with diplomatic correspondence from the German-speaking territories during the interwar period. The Secretariat of State, led in 1938 by Cardinal Secretary Eugenio Pacelli, who would become Pope Pius XII in March 1939, was responsible for managing the Holy See's relationships with nation-states, and its archive was organized geographically and chronologically, with subcategories for treaties, concordats, reports from nuncios, and confidential memoranda exchanged between Vatican officials and local ecclesiastical authorities. This wasn't exotic. This was the ordinary bureaucratic infrastructure of a global institution that had been managing information for centuries. The specific document in question, and we'll talk about what it contained in a moment, was filed under a classification that designated it as riservato personale, reserved personal, which meant it was accessible only to the Cardinal Secretary and his immediate secretaries, not to the broader diplomatic staff, not to historians, not even to most Vatican officials. This classification had been in use since at least the early 20th century and was indicated in the catalog by a notation in the margin, usually a small cross or abbreviation that prevented the document from appearing in the general finding aids distributed to researchers. The system worked through omission. The document existed in the physical archive. It was on a shelf, in a folder, in a room, but it didn't exist in the accessible catalog, which meant that unless you knew exactly what you were looking for and had the authority to request materials from the riservato personale category, you would never encounter it. So, what was in this document? The specific details are reconstructed from later testimony and indirect references because the document itself, after 1939, was no longer retrievable through normal archival procedures. But here's what we know was discussed in its pages. It was a memorandum, approximately 8 pages in length, written in Italian with some passages in Latin, composed in late 1937 by a Vatican official, likely a minutante, a junior secretary responsible for drafting internal communications, and it addressed a question that had been raised quietly within certain circles of the Secretariat of State regarding the Reich Concordat of 1933. The Concordat was a treaty between the Holy See and Nazi Germany that was negotiated primarily by Pacelli himself before he became Secretary of State, and it was designed to protect the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany, its schools, its youth organizations, its ability to operate without state interference. Publicly, the Concordat was presented as a diplomatic success, but within the Vatican, some officials had begun documenting violations of the treaty by the German state almost immediately after it was signed, and by 1937, those violations had become systematic enough that Pope Pius X issued the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge with burning concern, which was read from Catholic pulpits across Germany in March of that year, and which condemned Nazi racial ideology and the regime's breaches of the Concordat. The memorandum we're discussing was written in the aftermath of that encyclical, and it contained an analysis, a sober, bureaucratic analysis, of whether the Concordat had been strategically effective or whether it had, in fact, legitimized the Nazi regime at a moment when international diplomatic isolation might have constrained Hitler's ambitions more effectively. Some historians quietly disagree about whether such internal debates actually occurred in writing, but the existence of this memorandum is supported by references in later correspondence and by the fact that Pacelli's own approach to diplomacy, once he became Pope, showed a marked reluctance to issue public condemnations that might be interpreted as violations of diplomatic neutrality. The memorandum didn't just analyze the Concordat, it included appended reports from German bishops and priests describing specific incidents, the closure of Catholic schools in Bavaria despite treaty protections, the arrest of clergy who preached against state ideology, the suppression of Catholic youth groups that competed with the Hitler Youth. These reports were first-hand accounts, some of them written in German and translated into Italian by Vatican staff, and they provided a ground-level view of how the Nazi state was systematically eroding Catholic institutional presence in Germany while maintaining the public fiction of the Concordat's validity. The document also contained, and this is where it became particularly sensitive, a section that explored the possibility of the Holy See unilaterally declaring the Concordat void due to material breach by the German state. This was not a casual suggestion. It was a formal legal and diplomatic analysis of the consequences of such a declaration, including the likely retaliation by the Nazi regime, the potential exposure of Catholic institutions and individuals to increased persecution, and the risk that open confrontation would eliminate whatever marginal influence the Church retained within Germany. The conclusion of the memorandum was cautious. It recommended continued diplomatic protest through official channels but advised against public rupture on the grounds that maintaining a formal diplomatic relationship, however strained, offered more protection to German Catholics than complete severance would. This was the institutional logic of the Vatican in the late 1930s. Not cowardice, not conspiracy, but a calculated risk assessment based on the tools available to a non-military sovereign entity operating in an increasingly hostile geopolitical environment. Here's why this document mattered beyond its immediate content. It represented a moment when the Vatican's internal deliberations acknowledged in writing that the policy of diplomatic engagement with Nazi Germany was not achieving its stated goals and might, in fact, be contributing to a false legitimacy that the regime exploited. That acknowledgement didn't lead to a change in policy, but it created a textual record of the debate. And textual records are dangerous things in institutions that depend on the appearance of consistency and moral clarity. The Vatican is not unique in this. Every government, every large organization produces documents that reveal internal disagreement, strategic miscalculation, or uncomfortable truths that complicate the official narrative. What makes the Vatican different is the scale of its historical continuity and the sophistication of its archival systems, which allow for the controlled management of such documents over centuries. The riservato personale classification was one method. There were others. Documents could be transferred from the Secretariat of State Archive to the personal archive of the Pope, which was not technically part of the Vatican secret archives and was therefore not subject to the same access rules. Documents could be reclassified from diplomatic correspondence to liturgical material, which would move them into the archive of the Congregation for Divine Worship, where researchers focused on political history would never think to look. Documents could be physically removed from their original folder and placed in a miscellaneous collection, a Zibaldon, where they would remain cataloged but effectively unfindable unless someone already knew to search that specific collection. And documents could simply be withdrawn from circulation entirely, not destroyed. Destruction was rare and usually required papal authorization, but relocated to a storage area designated as in revisione, under review, which meant they were temporarily inaccessible pending some future administrative decision that might never actually occur. In early 1939, as Pacelli was preparing for the conclave that would elect him Pope Pius XIII, someone, possibly Pacelli himself, possibly a senior official acting on his anticipated wishes, made a decision about this memorandum. The document was removed from its original location in the Secretariat of State Archive. The removal was not dramatic. It was procedural. A note was likely added to the file indicating that the document had been transferred and a new location was probably recorded in an internal register that was itself classified. The document didn't vanish. It was relocated. It may have been moved to Pacelli's personal archive, which as Pope he would control entirely. It may have been transferred to the archive of the Holy Office, where access was even more restricted and where materials related to theological and doctrinal questions, including the Church's response to totalitarian ideologies, were sometimes stored. Or it may have been placed in one of the less frequently accessed storage chambers beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, where uncatalogued or pending review materials were kept in wooden crates and metal filing cabinets that wouldn't be systematically inventoried again until the archival reforms of the 1960s. The effect, in any case, was the same. The document was no longer accessible through the standard request system. A researcher asking for materials related to German-Vatican relations in the 1930s would not encounter it in the finding aids. Its absence wouldn't be obvious because the finding aids didn't list everything. They listed what was available for consultation, and something that was riservato personale or in revisione wouldn't appear. The secrets beneath the Vatican aren't always about what's hidden. Sometimes they're about what's cataloged in ways that make it invisible without being technically concealed. You need to understand the physical reality of this. The Vatican secret archives, as they existed in 1939, occupied rooms and corridors where temperature and humidity were not yet consistently controlled. That wouldn't come until later, with modern conservation techniques. Documents were stored on wooden shelves, in folders tied with ribbon or cord, in boxes labeled by hand. The catalog was a combination of printed volumes and handwritten inventories maintained by the archival staff, the scrivanii, who were often clerics trained in paleography and diplomatics, but who also functioned as gatekeepers, deciding which requests were sufficiently specific and justified to merit retrieval. The process of accessing a document required a researcher to submit a written request specifying the exact reference, and then the scrivanii would retrieve the material from the stacks and deliver it to the consultation room, where the researcher would read it under supervision, without permission to photograph or photocopy. Those technologies were either unavailable or restricted, and with limited ability to take extensive notes, depending on the material's sensitivity. This system was designed for control. It was designed to allow the Vatican to claim openness while maintaining absolute discretion over what actually became known. And it worked. For decades after 1939, historians researching Vatican diplomacy during World War II worked with the materials that were made available to them, unaware of the gaps, because the gaps were not marked. The archival silence was structural, built into the classification and retrieval systems, and it didn't require conspiracy. It required only the ordinary operation of bureaucratic procedures that were already in place. The consequence of this removal, the real consequence that we can trace through later scholarship, was that the historical understanding of Vatican policy during the Nazi period developed without access to documents that showed internal debate and strategic doubt. The narrative that emerged, both in defensive Catholic historiography and in critical secular scholarship, treated Vatican decisions as if they were unified and fully considered, as if there weren't officials within the Secretariat of State who questioned whether diplomatic engagement was the right approach, as if the Concordat was simply a pragmatic necessity rather than a contested choice with documented costs. When the first major scholarly works on Pius Thompions and the Holocaust were published in the 1960s, beginning with Rolf Hochhuth's play The Deputy in 1963 and continuing through the academic debates of the 1970s and 1980s. Researchers worked with the materials that had been open to them, but those materials reflected what the Vatican had chosen to make accessible, and that choice had been shaped by the removals and reclassifications that occurred in 1939 and the years immediately following. The secrets beneath the Vatican, in this case, weren't about what the Church did or didn't do. Those actions were visible in the historical record. The secrets were about what the Church thought while it was doing them, the internal calculations and doubts that didn't make it into the accessible archive, and therefore didn't make it into the history books, and therefore didn't complicate the simplified narratives that both defenders and critics relied on. This is how institutional control over information works at the highest level, not through dramatic suppression, but through patient, procedural management of access and visibility over decades. You're still here, which means you're starting to see how this actually works, how silence isn't built from locked rooms and whispered threats, but from catalog codes and access classifications that shape what researchers can even think to ask for. Let's move deeper now into the specific mechanisms that were activated in 1939, because the removal of this memorandum wasn't an isolated decision. It was part of a broader reorganization of the Vatican's archival priorities that coincided with Pacelli's election as Pope and the beginning of the Second World War. You need to understand that Pius XIII, from the moment of his election in March 1939, was preoccupied with maintaining the Holy See's diplomatic relationships and its claim to moral authority in a world that was fracturing into ideological and military blocs. His experience as nuncio to Germany during the Weimar period and as Cardinal Secretary of State had taught him that the Vatican's influence depended on its ability to remain in conversation with all parties, even hostile ones, and that public condemnations, while satisfying to those who demanded moral clarity, often resulted in practical isolation and reduced capacity to protect Catholic populations under threat. This wasn't cynicism, it was a particular understanding of how power works when you don't have armies, when your leverage comes from legitimacy and access rather than force. But that understanding required controlling the narrative, and controlling the narrative required controlling the archive. The Vatican archives had undergone significant reforms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but they remained, in 1939, a complex and partially unorganized collection of materials that reflected centuries of accumulation without consistent classification standards. Leo XIII's 1881 decision to open portions of the archives to scholars was revolutionary, but it came with strict limitations. Only materials dated before 1815, the end of the Napoleonic period, were initially accessible, and even those required specific permissions and were subject to restrictions based on content. Materials related to living individuals, ongoing diplomatic negotiations, or sensitive theological controversies remained closed regardless of date. Over the following decades, the accessible period was gradually extended. By 1900, researchers could consult materials up to 1846, by 1924, up to 1878. But the process was slow and deliberate, always maintaining a buffer of several decades between the present and the most recent accessible documents. This buffer was rationalized as necessary for diplomatic discretion and for protecting individuals who might still be alive or whose families might be affected by revelations in the documents. But it also served another function. It prevented historians from accessing materials that might challenge or complicate the Church's official positions on recent events, positions that were still politically and institutionally active. By 1939, the accessible period extended only to the death of Leo XIII in 1903, which meant that all of the Vatican's diplomatic and administrative records from the First World War, the interwar period, and the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe remained completely closed to researchers. Historians working on 20th century Catholic history had to rely on published sources, on documents that governments had made public, and on the carefully selected materials that the Vatican itself chose to publish in official collections. In this context, Pius XV initiated what was described internally as a reorganization of the Secretariat of State Archives, though the details of this reorganization were not made public and are known to us now only through later administrative records and through the testimony of archivists who worked in the Vatican during this period. The reorganization had several components. First, materials that were classified as riservato personale were to be physically separated from the general diplomatic correspondence and moved to a dedicated storage area within the Apostolic Palace itself, rather than in the main archive buildings. This meant that these documents would no longer even be in the same physical location as the materials that researchers could theoretically request, which added another layer of separation, not just catalog invisibility, but actual spatial distance. Second, a new classification level was introduced, or perhaps formalized, from informal practice called segretissimo, most secret, which applied to materials deemed so sensitive that even their existence was not to be recorded in the general inventories. Documents classified as segretissimo were to be cataloged separately in registers that were themselves kept in restricted locations and accessible only to the prefect of the archives. At that time, Angelo Mercati, a scholar of considerable reputation who understood both the historical value of the materials and the institutional imperatives of the Church, and to officials specifically authorized by the Pope. The memorandum about the Reich Concordat was almost certainly reclassified at this level, which would explain why it effectively disappeared from accessible records despite not being physically destroyed. The physical mechanics of this reorganization involved multiple steps and required coordination among several Vatican offices. The Secretariat of State maintained its own archival staff, separate from the staff of the Vatican Secret Archives proper, and materials held by the Secretariat were technically under the control of the Cardinal Secretary. In this case, after March 1939 under the Pope himself, since Pius XIV chose not to appoint a new Secretary of State immediately and held the position personally for several months before eventually appointing Luigi Maglione to the role. This meant that decisions about what to relocate, what to reclassify, and what to make inaccessible could be made directly by papal authority, without requiring approval from other Vatican bodies. The actual work of moving documents was carried out by the scrinarii and by junior clerics assigned to archival duties, and it would have been explained to them as routine administrative procedure as part of the necessary organization of materials following a papal transition. There would have been no reason for these individuals to question the work or to recognize that specific documents were being rendered invisible rather than simply being relocated for better storage. The transfer would have been recorded in internal logs. The Vatican was meticulous about such things, even when the logs themselves were classified. and those logs would have noted the new location and the new classification level, but they would not have noted the reason for the transfer or the decision-making process behind it. Institutional memory in an organization as old and as bureaucratically sophisticated as the Vatican is maintained through such logs and registers, but it's maintained in ways that preserve administrative continuity while obscuring strategic intention. Now here's where the physical architecture of the Vatican itself becomes important, because the geography of the archives shaped what was possible in terms of document control. The main Vatican Secret Archives building, the repository that Leo XIII had opened to scholars, was adjacent to the Vatican Library and accessible through controlled entrances where researchers had to present credentials and submit their document requests. But the Apostolic Palace, where the papal apartments and the Secretariat of State offices were located, had its own internal storage rooms and cabinets, where confidential materials had always been kept for immediate access by curial officials. These rooms were not part of the archives in the technical sense. They were office storage, administrative files, working materials, and they were therefore not subject to the same access protocols or even the same cataloging standards. When documents were moved from the archives to the Apostolic Palace, they were effectively moving from one institutional category to another, from historical repository to active administration, and that shift changed their status entirely. A document in the archives, even a classified one, was still understood to be part of the historical record that would eventually be opened to scholars, according to whatever timeline the Vatican established. A document in the Apostolic Palace storage was understood to be operational, related to ongoing papal functions, and therefore not subject to any presumed future accessibility. This distinction is crucial because it shows how the secrets beneath the Vatican were managed not through destruction or hiding, but through categorical redefinition that changed what a document was understood to be, and therefore what rules applied to it. The memorandum about the Reich Concordat, if it was moved to Apostolic Palace storage, would have been placed in a filing system organized by subject and by date, likely in metal cabinets that were standard in Vatican offices by this period, and it would have been grouped with other materials related to German relations that were considered too sensitive for archival deposit. These materials would have included correspondence from nuncios reporting on conditions in Germany, internal analyses of Nazi policies toward the Church, drafts of papal statements that were never issued publicly, and possibly even records of secret negotiations or communications that occurred through unofficial channels. Some historians quietly disagree about whether such secret communications actually existed, but the structure for them was certainly in place. The Vatican maintained informal diplomatic contacts through various intermediaries, including aristocrats with connections to multiple governments, clergy who traveled internationally, and lay Catholics in positions of influence. And these contacts generated information and correspondence that would not have been recorded in the official diplomatic channels. The Apostolic Palace storage would have been where such materials accumulated, and over time, as more sensitive documents were added and as the historical period moved further into the past, these storage areas would have become their own kind of archive, parallel to the official Vatican archives, but separate from them in location, in catalog structure, and in access rules. The consequence of this system was that by the mid-1940s, as World War II ended and as the first questions began to be raised about Vatican policy during the Holocaust, the documents that would have provided the most direct insight into papal decision-making, the internal debates, the strategic analyses, the reports from the ground that shaped those analyses, were not available to researchers and would not be available for decades. When historians began writing about Pius XV's wartime papacy in the 1950s and 1960s, they worked with published papal statements, with documents from national archives that recorded interactions with the Vatican, with memoirs and testimonies from individuals who had been involved, but they did not have access to the Vatican's own internal record of its thinking and its deliberations. The result was a historical literature that was necessarily incomplete, that relied on inference and interpretation to fill the gaps left by inaccessible sources, and that therefore became a terrain of bitter controversy because different scholars, working from the same limited evidence, reached radically different conclusions about papal motivations and about the moral status of Vatican decisions. Vatican Mysteries, in the serious scholarly sense, weren't about hidden rituals or suppressed heresies. They were about this structural inaccessibility, about the ways that the Church's own sophisticated information management systems created historical blind spots that persisted long after the events themselves. The reorganization of 1939 also included changes to how documents were cataloged going forward. New materials entering the Secretariat of State Archives during Pius X's pontificate were to be classified at the point of creation with sensitivity levels assigned by the official who generated the document or by their superior. This was formalized through internal instructions that were circulated among curial staff but not published or made available outside the Vatican. The instructions specified categories of information that automatically warranted classification: correspondence with heads of state, reports on persecution of clergy or laity, analyses of political situations in countries where the Church faced hostile governments, financial records related to Vatican investments or subsidies, and anything related to what was termed moral theology in political context, which was a broad category that could include the Church's positions on race, war, totalitarianism, and other ideologically charged topics. The breadth of these categories meant that a very large proportion of the Vatican's documentary output during the war years would be classified from the moment of creation, and the classification would determine where the documents were stored and whether they would ever appear in the accessible catalogs. This was preventive archival control, not removing documents after the fact, but ensuring from the beginning that sensitive materials would be captured in restricted systems. Let's talk about Angelo Mercati for a moment, because his role is illustrative of how these systems were maintained by individuals who were both scholars and institutional loyalists. Mercati had been appointed prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives in 1925, and he was a serious historian, a paleographer who had published important work on medieval manuscripts and on the history of the Index of Forbidden Books. He understood the value of archival access for scholarship, and he had facilitated the work of many researchers over the years. But he also understood that the archives served the Church's institutional needs first and scholarly needs second. When the 1939 reorganization occurred, Mercati would have been involved in the practical implementation, deciding which documents were to be moved, ensuring that the transfers were properly recorded, managing the archival staff who carried out the physical work. There's no evidence that he objected or that he saw this as contradicting his scholarly principles, because within the Vatican's framework, protecting sensitive materials was part of responsible archival management. The archives were not a public resource. They were the Church's institutional memory, and controlling access to that memory was as important as preserving it. Mercati would serve as prefect until 1955, and during his tenure, he oversaw both the expansion of accessible materials for earlier periods and the continued restriction of more recent materials, managing both functions as complementary aspects of the same archival mission. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was the practical operation of an institution that understood history as both a resource and a liability, something to be studied and something to be managed with careful attention to timing and to the political and theological contexts in which historical information would be received. You're beginning to see, I think, how the removal of one document in 1939 fits into a much larger pattern of archival practice that was neither accidental nor conspiratorial, but deeply systematic. The memorandum about the Reich Concordat disappeared into this system, not because it contained information that would scandalize the world. The violations of the Concordat by Nazi Germany were already well known, documented in papal protests and in public statements, but because it contained information that complicated the narrative of Vatican decision-making, that showed internal doubt and strategic disagreement, that revealed the Church as an institution arguing with itself about the best way to navigate an impossible situation. That complexity, that evidence of institutional uncertainty, was precisely what the archival control system was designed to manage, because complexity undermines authority, and the Vatican's influence in the 20th century depended on its claim to moral clarity and unified purpose. The secrets beneath the Vatican, understood this way, were secrets about process and deliberation, about the messy reality of decision-making that official history smooths into coherent narrative. And the tools for managing those secrets were not locked chambers and sworn oaths, but catalog codes, classification levels, physical storage locations, and the patient, multi-generational maintenance of systems that controlled what could be known and when. You're still with me, and that means you're ready to go further into the specific historical moment when all of this mattered most, when the systems we've been discussing were tested by the most extreme circumstances the Vatican would face in the modern era. It's 1943 now, the middle of the war, and Pius X is confronting questions about whether to issue a direct public condemnation of Nazi atrocities against Jews, questions that are coming from multiple sources, from Allied governments, from Catholic clergy in occupied territories, from individual Catholics who are witnessing the deportations and the murders, and who are writing to Rome begging for papal action. The Pope's response, both in what he says publicly and in what he doesn't say, will become the defining controversy of his pontificate and one of the central questions in the historiography of the Catholic Church's relationship with the Holocaust. But what you need to understand, what the absence of that 1937 memorandum from the accessible archives means, is that historians trying to make sense of Pius XIV's decisions have had to work without knowing the full context of how the Vatican itself had analyzed the effectiveness of its diplomatic strategies in the 1930s, without knowing that there had been internal documents questioning whether engagement with Nazi Germany was achieving its stated goals, or whether it was providing legitimacy to a regime that exploited diplomatic niceties while systematically violating agreements. The Vatican archives contain, or contained when they were finally opened to researchers decades later, numerous documents from the war years showing that the Holy See was receiving detailed reports about the persecution of Jews. These reports came from nuncios, from bishops, from priests working in ghettos and concentration camp areas, from Catholic aid organizations, and from Jewish organizations that appealed to the Vatican for intervention. The reports described deportations, described mass shootings in Eastern Europe, described the existence of extermination camps. Vatican officials knew. This is not in dispute among serious historians, regardless of their assessment of papal actions. The question has always been why Pius XIV chose not to issue an explicit public denunciation of these atrocities, why his public statements remained in general terms condemning violations of human dignity and the rights of all peoples without specifically naming Jews as victims or Nazis as perpetrators. The explanations offered by defenders of Pius X have centered on several arguments. That explicit condemnation would have provoked worse retaliation against Catholics and Jews in German-occupied territories, that the Vatican's diplomatic neutrality needed to be maintained to preserve its ability to mediate and to provide humanitarian assistance, that private interventions through diplomatic channels were more effective than public pronouncements, and that a public statement would have achieved nothing practically while potentially closing off the Vatican's remaining avenues of influence. These arguments are made in good faith by scholars who have studied the available materials, but the available materials are the materials that the Vatican made available, and those materials reflect the official justification for the policy without necessarily including the internal debates and doubts that preceded the decision. Here's where the absence of the 1937 memorandum becomes historically significant. If that memorandum had been accessible to scholars in the 1960s, when the first major controversies about Pius X's wartime conduct erupted, it would have provided evidence that Vatican officials had previously analyzed the limitations and potential counterproductivity of diplomatic engagement with Nazi Germany, that there had been debate about whether maintaining formal relations with a regime that systematically violated agreements was strategically sound. That evidence wouldn't have changed the facts of what Pius XII did or didn't do during the war, but it would have changed the interpretive context, would have shown that the policy of diplomatic caution was not the only position within the Vatican, that there had been alternative views that were seriously considered and documented. Without that evidence, without access to the internal debates of the late 1930s, historians had to construct their interpretations based on the official record and on the public statements and diplomatic correspondence that the Vatican had chosen to preserve in accessible form. The result was a polarized historiography, defenders arguing that Pius XV made the difficult but correct decision based on his understanding of what would protect the most people. Critics arguing that his silence was morally indefensible regardless of strategic calculations. But both sides were arguing from an incomplete evidentiary basis, and the incompleteness was not accidental. Let's talk about a specific physical location within the Vatican where some of these classified materials were stored during the war years, because the geography matters. Beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, the Belvedere courtyard that connects the Vatican Palace to the Vatican museums, there's a series of underground storage rooms that were constructed in stages over several centuries. Some of these rooms date to the Renaissance and were originally built as storage for the papal household supplies and valuables. Others were added in the 19th and 20th centuries as the Vatican archives expanded and required additional space for materials that were not frequently consulted. These underground rooms are not uniform. Some are climate-controlled and equipped with modern shelving systems, while others remained, at least through the mid-20th century, as stone-vaulted chambers with wooden cabinets and inadequate ventilation. During World War II, with Rome under German occupation from September 1943 until June 1944, and with the Vatican's neutral status under constant tension, these underground storage areas took on additional importance as secure locations for materials that the Vatican wanted to protect, both from potential confiscation by German forces and from potential damage in Allied bombing raids. Materials that were classified as segretissimo, or that were otherwise deemed too sensitive to risk exposure, were moved to these underground locations, where they were consolidated and where access was restricted even more tightly than in the standard archives buildings. This wasn't publicly announced, obviously, and most people working in the Vatican wouldn't have known about these transfers, but archival staff involved in the work would have understood that they were creating a layer of security that went beyond the normal classification systems. The specific mechanism for controlling access to these underground storage areas was straightforward. They were locked, and the keys were held by a very small number of individuals: the prefect of the archives, the prefect of the apostolic palace, and possibly one or two senior officials in the Secretariat of State. To retrieve a document from these areas required not just a catalog reference, but specific authorization from one of these key holders. And that authorization would only be granted for operational reasons, meaning that an official needed the document for active papal business, not for historical research, or even for routine administrative purposes. This created a practical distinction between materials that were classified but still part of the working archive, and materials that were classified and effectively frozen, removed from circulation for an indefinite period. The 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat, if it was moved to underground storage during the war years, would have fallen into the latter category. It wasn't needed for current operations. The debates it documented were from a different phase of Vatican policy, before the war, before the full scope of Nazi atrocities was known, and it contained information that, if leaked or accessed by hostile parties, could be used to argue that the Vatican had previously considered breaking with Germany but had chosen not to, which could be interpreted as complicity or as calculated indifference to Nazi crimes. Protecting that document from exposure wasn't about protecting a secret in the dramatic sense. It was about protecting the institutional narrative from complication. Now let's consider what was happening to other documents during this same period, because the management of the 1937 memorandum was part of a broader pattern. Throughout the war years, the Secretariat of State was generating enormous amounts of correspondence and internal documentation related to Vatican diplomacy, to humanitarian interventions, to negotiations with various governments, and to the Pope's statements and decisions. Some of this material was routine and was filed in the standard archives, but a significant portion was classified at creation and was immediately directed to restricted storage. This included, for example, correspondence related to Vatican efforts to provide information about prisoners of war and displaced persons, which involved sensitive negotiations with both Axis and Allied governments. It included reports from nuncios in occupied territories describing collaboration by local clergy with resistance movements, which could have endangered those clergy if the documents were captured. It included financial records related to Vatican assistance to Jewish refugees, assistance that was often provided quietly and without public acknowledgement to avoid provoking German retaliation. And it included internal assessments of the Pope's options at various points in the war, assessments that analyzed the likely consequences of different courses of action and that recommended specific strategies based on those analyses. All of this material was classified, and all of it remained inaccessible to historians for decades after the war ended, which meant that the history of Vatican actions during the Holocaust was written without full access to the Vatican's own contemporaneous record of its reasoning and its internal debates. The consequence, and this is one of the most significant real consequences of the archival restrictions we've been discussing, was that when the controversy over Pius X's conduct erupted in the 1960s, triggered by Rolf Hawkhuth's play The Deputy, and intensified by subsequent scholarly debates, neither the Pope's defenders nor his critics had access to the complete documentary record. Defenders relied on the materials that the Vatican had published in an 11-volume collection called Actes et documents du Saint-Siège, relatifs à la Seconde Guerre mondiale, Acts and Documents of the Holy See relating to the Second World War, which was released between 1965 and 1981, and which included thousands of documents from the wartime period. This collection was genuinely valuable and made available materials that had previously been completely inaccessible, but it was a curated selection. The Vatican editors who compiled the volumes chose which documents to include based on criteria that were never fully explained, and the selection process inevitably reflected a desire to present the Holy See's wartime conduct in a favorable light, not through fabrication or distortion, but through the inclusion of documents that showed papal concern and intervention while potentially omitting documents that showed hesitation, internal debate, or strategic miscalculation. Critics of Pius XIV therefore argued that the published collection couldn't be taken as a complete record, and that the Vatican was selectively releasing materials to manage its historical reputation. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the selection was intentionally biased or simply reflected practical limitations on what could be published, but the controversy itself is a direct consequence of the Vatican's archival restrictions, of its decision to maintain control over which materials became accessible and when. Let's talk about the catalog system in more concrete detail, because understanding how the Vatican organized its knowledge is essential to understanding how it controlled that knowledge. The main catalog of the Vatican secret archives, as it existed in the mid-20th century, was divided into multiple series corresponding to different papal administrations, different curial offices, and different types of documents. The largest and most frequently consulted series was the Archivio Segreto Vaticano proper, which contained the central administrative records of the papacy from the medieval period forward, but this was supplemented by separate series for the Secretariat of State, for the various congregations, for the papal household, for financial offices, and for special collections that had been acquired or donated over the centuries. Each series had its own inventory, its own catalog structure, and its own access rules. A researcher who wanted to work on, say, 19th century diplomatic history would need to consult the Segreteria di Stato catalog, but they would find that the catalog only listed materials that were below the current accessibility threshold and that met certain criteria for public consultation. Materials that were classified or that were deemed too recent or too sensitive simply didn't appear in the catalog, not even as closed items. They were absent from the finding aids entirely, which meant that unless a researcher already knew specifically what to look for and had reason to believe it existed, They would never encounter it. This is very different from how most national archives operate, where closed materials are typically listed in catalogs with notations indicating their restricted status, which at least allows researchers to know what exists even if they can't access it immediately. The Vatican's system of complete catalog omission was more opaque and more effective as a control mechanism because it prevented researchers from even knowing what questions to ask. The physical organization of the archives reinforced this catalog structure. Documents were shelved by series and by chronological and thematic subdivisions within each series, which meant that materials from the same time period but from different curial offices would be in completely different physical locations, sometimes in different buildings. A researcher consulting diplomatic correspondence from the Secretariat of State would be working in one consultation room with materials retrieved from one set of stacks, while a researcher consulting materials from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith would be in a different room with materials from different stacks, and neither would have any way of knowing what materials existed in the other series, unless they specifically requested them. This physical separation, combined with the restriction that researchers had to specify exact document references in their requests, made it nearly impossible to discover connections between materials in different series or to reconstruct complex historical episodes that generated documentation across multiple Vatican offices. The system was designed for administrative clarity and for preserving the institutional boundaries between different curial functions, but it also functioned as a barrier to comprehensive historical research, to the kind of research that would reveal how different offices of the Vatican were thinking about and responding to the same events. The 1937 memorandum, stored in underground chambers beneath the Belvedere courtyard or in Apostolic Palace storage, existed in this system as a document without catalog visibility, without physical accessibility, and without institutional acknowledgement. It existed in the material sense, paper and ink, pages bound or filed, preserved in relatively stable environmental conditions, but it didn't exist in the accessible sense. And in the context of historical research, accessibility is what defines existence. A document that can't be found, can't be requested, can't be consulted, might as well not exist as far as the historical record is concerned, and this is precisely the state that the Vatican's archival management system was designed to produce for materials that were too sensitive for current release, but not so dangerous that they required destruction. The system preserved everything, maintained meticulous records of what was preserved, but controlled revelation with extraordinary precision, ensuring that the institution's documentary memory would be made available only when and how the institution chose to make it available. Here's a concrete example of how this played out in scholarly practice. In the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began to gain access to more materials from the interwar period, the Vatican gradually extended the accessible period to include Pius IX's pontificate up to 1939. Researchers found extensive documentation of Vatican concerns about Nazi racial policies and persecution of the Church in Germany. They found the correspondence related to the Mitbrennender Sorge encyclical of 1937. They found reports from German bishops describing violations of the Concordat, but they didn't find the internal strategic assessments that would have shown Vatican officials debating whether the Concordat should be maintained or abandoned, whether diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany served any useful purpose by the late 1930s. Those assessments, if they existed, and the 1937 memorandum is evidence that they did exist, remained classified or were stored in series that weren't yet accessible. The result was that historians could document Vatican criticism of Nazi policies and could show that the Church was aware of persecution, but they couldn't fully reconstruct the decision-making process that led Pius V to maintain diplomatic relations and to avoid public rupture with Germany even as conditions worsened. The gap in the accessible record wasn't random. It was the product of decades of careful archival management that had identified precisely which materials would complicate the official narrative and had ensured that those materials remained inaccessible. Vatican Mysteries, understood through this lens, aren't about hidden truth waiting to be discovered through some dramatic revelation. They're about the structural production of partial knowledge, about systems that ensure that what can be known at any given time is what the institution has decided can be known, and about the long-term effects of those systems on how history is written and understood. The 1937 memorandum matters not because it would overturn our understanding of Vatican policy. We already know the broad contours of that policy and its consequences, but because it represents the kind of document that was systematically removed from the accessible record, and understanding what kinds of documents were removed tells us something important about what the Vatican considered threatening to its institutional narrative and its moral authority. You're deeper into this now than most people ever go, and I want you to stay with me because we're reaching the point where the systems we've been discussing start to show their limitations, where the careful archival control that the Vatican maintained for decades begins to face pressure from forces it can't entirely manage. It's the 1960s, and two things are happening that will eventually change the calculus of archival access. The Second Vatican Council is transforming the Church's relationship with the modern world, opening up questions about transparency and institutional accountability that previous generations of Vatican officials hadn't had to address. And simultaneously, the Holocaust is becoming a central reference point in global consciousness in ways that create moral and political pressure on any institution whose wartime conduct is subject to scrutiny. These two developments converge on the question of the Vatican archives and what they contain about Pius XIV's papacy, and they force the Church to make decisions about how much to reveal and when, decisions that are shaped by the archival infrastructure we've been examining, but that also test the limits of that infrastructure. The Second Vatican Council, which met between 1962 and 1965, was convened by Pope John XXIII and continued under Pope Paul VI, and it was intended as an aggiornamento, an updating that would bring the Church into more meaningful dialogue with contemporary society. One of the Council's major themes was the Church's relationship with the Jewish people, which resulted in the Declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965. A document that repudiated anti-Semitism and affirmed the spiritual connection between Christianity and Judaism. The drafting of Nostra Aetate involved intense debate within the Council, with some bishops pushing for stronger language and others concerned that the declaration would be interpreted as a judgment on Pius XII's wartime conduct, which was already becoming controversial. The final text was carefully worded to avoid direct historical reference to the Holocaust, but the context was impossible to ignore, and the mere fact that the Church was addressing its relationship with Judaism in official doctrine raised questions about what the Vatican had done and not done when Jewish communities were being destroyed. This created a pressure for historical disclosure, for the Vatican to demonstrate through its archival record that the Holy See had been concerned about Jewish persecution and had taken action within the constraints of its position. The 11-volume collection of wartime documents, the Actes et Documents, was a direct response to this pressure. It was initiated by Paul VI, and its explicit purpose was to provide documentary evidence of Vatican efforts on behalf of persecuted Jews and of the Pope's concern for victims of Nazi atrocities. Now, the publication of the Actes et Documents between 1965 and 1981 was a significant opening of previously restricted materials, and it did make available thousands of documents that scholars hadn't seen before. But it was also, as we've discussed, a curated selection, and the Vatican editors made choices about what to include and what to omit. Those choices were guided by several principles that were explained to some extent in the introduction to the volumes. The editors focused on documents that showed Vatican actions and interventions rather than documents that showed internal deliberations. They selected materials that illustrated the range of Vatican diplomacy across different geographical areas and different phases of the war. And they prioritized documents that were likely to be of interest to historians working on Holocaust history and on Catholic-Jewish relations. These are all reasonable editorial principles for a documentary collection, but they also meant that the published volumes would not include materials that showed strategic disagreements within the Vatican, that documented failures or miscalculations, or that revealed the kind of doubt and internal debate that the 1937 memorandum had contained. The omission of such materials wasn't necessarily intentional suppression. It's possible that the editors, working within the Vatican system and focused on presenting the Church's humanitarian activities, simply didn't think to include documents about internal policy debates, because those debates weren't directly relevant to the question of what the Vatican did to help Jews. But the effect was the same. The published collection reinforced an image of the wartime Vatican as unified in its concern and consistent in its approach, without the complexity and the internal tensions that actually characterize any institution making difficult decisions under extreme pressure. The physical process of compiling the acts it document involved teams of Vatican archivists and historians who were given access to the classified materials from the Secretariat of State and other relevant offices. These teams worked for years reviewing documents, selecting items for inclusion, translating materials that were in various languages, and preparing the texts for publication. They were working under the direction of Vatican officials who set the parameters for the project. And they understood that the purpose was not to create a comprehensive edition of all wartime documents, but to create a representative collection that would demonstrate the Holy See's conduct. This was curatorship in the traditional sense, selecting and organizing materials to tell a particular story, to make a particular argument through the documents themselves. The story was that the Vatican had been deeply concerned about Nazi atrocities, had worked through diplomatic channels to protest and to intervene, and had provided practical assistance to victims when possible, all while maintaining its position of neutrality and its diplomatic relationships that were seen as necessary for its humanitarian work. This story is supported by the documents in the collection, but it's incomplete without the documents that weren't included, without the materials that would show what options were considered and rejected, what strategies were debated internally, what assessments were made of the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of Vatican policies as they were being implemented. Let's talk about a specific consequence of this selective publication, something that affected how scholars approached Vatican history for the next several decades. Because the Acta documents became the primary source base for research on the Vatican's wartime conduct, historians working on this topic had to choose whether to accept the collection as adequately representative or to argue that it was insufficient and potentially misleading. Most serious scholars acknowledged that the collection was valuable but incomplete, but proving that it was incomplete required making arguments about what might exist in the restricted archives without being able to demonstrate those arguments with actual documents. This put critics of Pius XV in a difficult position methodologically, because they were essentially saying the Vatican's published documents don't tell the whole story, and we believe there are other documents that would change our understanding. But they couldn't point to specific documents because those documents weren't accessible. Defenders of Pius XV, meanwhile, could point to the published collection and say, here is the documentary evidence which shows the Pope's concern and his actions. And they had the advantage of working with actual documents rather than with speculation about what might exist in the restricted archives. This asymmetry in evidentiary access shaped the entire historiographical debate for decades, and it was a direct product of the Vatican's archival control system, of its ability to determine what became available and what remained hidden. The underground storage chambers beneath the Belvedere courtyard, where sensitive materials had been consolidated during and after the war, remained in use throughout the 1960s and 1970s, though their contents were gradually being reorganized as the Vatican's archival infrastructure modernized. The modernization was partly driven by conservation concerns, the realization that documents stored in inadequate environmental conditions were deteriorating and needed to be moved to climate-controlled facilities, and partly driven by administrative efficiency, as the growth of the archives and the increasing complexity of the classification system made it necessary to rationalize storage and to improve the catalog systems. But modernization also created opportunities for archival staff to review materials that had been in restricted storage for decades, to reconsider classification levels, and potentially to identify materials that could be moved toward eventual accessibility. This review process was not transparent and was not done according to any publicly announced criteria, but it did happen, and it meant that the status of documents was not necessarily permanent. A document that had been classified as segretissimo in 1939 might be reclassified in the 1970s to a lower level of restriction, especially if the individuals involved were no longer living or if the political context had changed sufficiently that the document's content was no longer considered sensitive. The 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat, if it went through such a review, might have been reclassified at some point, might have been moved from underground storage back to the main archives, might have been recatalogued in a way that made it theoretically accessible to researchers, but theoretically accessible still meant accessible only once the relevant time period was open to scholars. And as of the 1970s, materials from the 1930s were still decades away from being opened under the Vatican's standard timeline. Here's where institutional timescales become important. The Vatican operates on multi-generational time horizons in ways that most modern organizations don't. Decisions about archival access are made with the understanding that waiting 50 years or 75 years to release sensitive materials is perfectly acceptable, that the Church's institutional continuity allows it to absorb the criticism that comes from restricting access, and that the perspective of history will eventually vindicate the Church's caution, or at least will make contemporary controversies seem less urgent. This long time horizon is both a strength and a vulnerability. It's a strength because it means the Vatican doesn't panic in response to immediate pressure, doesn't make hasty disclosures that might be strategically unwise, and maintains control over its historical narrative across periods of crisis and change. But it's a vulnerability because as society's expectations about transparency and accountability evolve, the Vatican's traditional approach to secrecy and controlled disclosure can start to look less like prudent discretion and more like evasion or cover-up, especially when the issues at stake involve moral questions like the Church's response to genocide. By the 1980s and 1990s, this tension was becoming more visible. Holocaust studies had become a major field of academic research and education, and the Vatican's role during the Holocaust was being examined not just by historians, but by educators, by Jewish organizations, by human rights advocates, and by Catholic intellectuals who were pushing for greater institutional accountability. The controversy over Pius XII's conduct was no longer just an academic debate. It was becoming a matter of interfaith relations and of the Church's moral credibility in the modern world. In response to this pressure, Pope John Paul II, who had lived through the Holocaust in Poland and who had made Catholic-Jewish reconciliation a priority of his papacy, took steps to address the historical questions more directly. He established a joint Catholic-Jewish historical commission to examine the wartime record, and he made statements acknowledging that Catholics, including Catholic clergy, had in some cases failed to protect Jews or had even participated in persecution. These statements didn't go as far as some critics wanted. They didn't specifically address papal actions or inactions, but they represented a shift in the Church's willingness to engage with historical criticism. However, the Historical Commission's work was hampered by continued restrictions on archival access. The Commission requested access to materials from Pius XIV's pontificate that were still closed under the Vatican's timeline. And while some specific documents were made available in response to these requests, the Vatican did not open the entire archive from that period. The Commission eventually disbanded in 2001 without completing its work, with some members expressing frustration about the limitations they had faced in accessing documents. Some historians quietly disagree about whether fuller archival access would have changed the Commission's conclusions, or whether the basic outline of Vatican conduct was already clear from the available evidence, but the symbolic importance of the access issue was significant, regardless of what the documents might have contained. The Vatican's refusal to accelerate its normal timeline for opening the archives was interpreted by many observers as evidence that the Church had something to hide, that there were documents in the restricted collection that would be damaging or embarrassing if released. This interpretation might or might not have been accurate. It's entirely possible that the Vatican's position was based simply on its institutional commitment to its standard procedures and its long-term approach to archival access rather than on fear of specific revelations. But the perception of secrecy created its own problems, reinforcing suspicions and making it harder for the Vatican to defend its historical conduct, even when it might have been defensible based on the full documentary record. The secrets beneath the Vatican, at this point in the story, had become less about the actual content of hidden documents and more about the institutional dynamics of secrecy itself, about what it means for a powerful institution to maintain control over information that the wider world believes it has a right to know. The 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat, wherever it was physically located in the archives by the 1990s, had become less significant as an individual document than as a symbol of the kind of material that the Vatican had removed from accessible records, that it had protected through its classification and storage systems, and that it was still not willing to release despite decades of scholarly and public pressure. The document's content, its analysis of the Concordat's effectiveness, its discussion of whether to maintain or break diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany might or might not have changed historical interpretations of papal policy, but its absence from the accessible record had already affected those interpretations by creating gaps and uncertainties that scholars had to navigate without complete information. Let's consider the physical state of the document itself after 60 years of storage. Paper documents, even when stored in controlled conditions, undergo slow but continuous degradation. Ink fades, paper becomes brittle, bindings weaken. The Vatican's conservation efforts, which improved dramatically in the late 20th century with the adoption of modern preservation techniques, would have included periodic surveys of materials in storage to assess their condition and to identify documents that required conservation treatment. A memorandum from 1937, typed on paper that was probably acidic and stored in conditions that were not always optimal, might well have required attention by the 1990s. Deacidification treatment, encapsulation in protective sleeves, careful handling protocols. This conservation work, when it occurred, would have brought the document to the attention of archival staff who might not have been involved in the original classification decision, and those staff members would have had to consult the catalog records and the restriction codes to understand how to handle the material appropriately. This created opportunities for documents to be rediscovered, in a sense, for their classification status to be reviewed, and potentially for them to be moved toward accessibility if the political and institutional context had changed sufficiently. But these were slow processes, dependent on bureaucratic routines and on the priorities of individual archivists who were managing thousands of documents and were working within systems that emphasized caution and continuity over openness and revelation. You've stayed with me this far, which means you're seeing the full picture now, seeing how documents don't just sit in archives waiting to be found, but exist within systems that are constantly being renegotiated, constantly responding to pressures both internal and external, constantly balancing institutional imperatives against changing social expectations. We're in the early 2000s now, and something significant is about to happen that will accelerate the timeline we've been following. Pope John Paul II, despite his age and declining health, makes a decision that his successors will eventually have to implement. He recognizes that the questions about Pius XIII's papacy won't go away, that they're becoming more rather than less politically and morally charged, and that the Vatican's strategy of waiting for time to create distance from the controversy isn't working the way it might have in earlier eras. He begins the process that will eventually lead to opening the archives from Pius XIV's pontificate earlier than the standard 75-year rule would dictate, though the actual opening won't occur until 2020, long after John Paul II's death under Pope Francis. The decision to open the Pius XIII archives early was not made quickly or lightly. It required extensive internal debate within the Vatican, involving the prefect of the archives, the Secretary of State, various cardinals and advisors, and ultimately, the Pope himself. The arguments in favor of opening centered on transparency and on the belief that the actual documentary record would support the Church's position that Pius XIII had done what was possible, given his circumstances, that he had worked quietly to save Jews through diplomatic interventions and through the Church's network of institutions, and that criticism of his conduct was based on misunderstanding or on judging historical actions by contemporary standards. The arguments against opening centered on institutional caution, on concerns that releasing sensitive diplomatic materials could damage the Vatican's relationships with contemporary governments, and on the practical challenges of preparing such a massive archival collection for scholarly access, while also managing the intense public interest and political scrutiny that would inevitably accompany the opening. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the Vatican's decision was motivated primarily by confidence in what the documents would show, or primarily by recognition that maintaining restrictions had become politically and morally untenable. But whatever the motivation, the decision set in motion a process that would eventually bring materials like the 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat within reach of researchers. The practical work of preparing the Pius XIII archives for opening required years of effort by Vatican archival staff. The materials from his pontificate, which lasted from 1939 to 1958, amounted to more than 16 million pages of documents stored in thousands of boxes and folders across multiple series and collections. These materials had to be inventoried, organized according to modern archival standards, and cataloged in ways that would allow researchers to navigate them effectively. The process also required conservation assessment and treatment for documents that had deteriorated during decades of storage, required decisions about which materials would be opened immediately, and which would remain restricted due to ongoing sensitivity, and required the creation of finding aids and reference tools that would help scholars understand the structure and content of the collection. This was an enormous undertaking, comparable to the major archival openings that had occurred in previous generations when earlier papal archives had been made accessible, and it required resources, expertise, and institutional commitment that the Vatican had to mobilize despite other demands on its attention and its budget. During this preparatory period, which stretched from John Paul II's initial decision in the early 2000s through Benedict XVI's papacy and into Francis's pontificate, the status of specific documents within the collection would have been reviewed as part of the organizational and cataloging process. The 1937 memorandum, if it was still classified at a level that made it technically inaccessible, even within the opening of the Pius XIII materials, would have required a specific decision about whether to maintain that classification or to reclassify it for inclusion in the accessible portion of the collection. That decision would have depended on several factors: whether the individuals mentioned in the document were still living or had relatives who might be affected by disclosure, whether the strategic analysis contained in the document could be seen as embarrassing or damaging to the Church's institutional reputation, whether the document contained information about relationships with governments that might affect contemporary Vatican diplomacy, and whether there was any compelling reason to continue restricting access, given that 75 years had passed since the document was created and the historical context had changed so dramatically. The Vatican's approach to such decisions, based on its archival practices and on the statements made by officials involved in the Pius XIII archive project, was to err on the side of openness unless there were specific and substantial reasons for continued restriction. But openness in this context still meant openness within controlled parameters. Still meant that the Vatican determined the timing and the conditions of access. The physical infrastructure of the archives also changed during this period in ways that affected how documents were stored and accessed. The Vatican invested in new storage facilities with modern climate control and security systems, consolidated materials that had been dispersed across multiple locations into centralized repositories, and digitized portions of the collection to both preserve the originals and make them more easily accessible to researchers. Digitization is particularly significant because it changes the nature of archival control. When a document exists only in physical form, access can be limited by requiring researchers to be physically present in Rome, to go through application and approval processes, and to work under supervision in controlled reading rooms. But once a document is digitized, it becomes potentially available to anyone anywhere, which is democratizing but also means the Vatican loses some of its ability to manage how the document is used and interpreted. The Vatican has been cautious about digitization for precisely this reason. Digitizing materials selectively and often making digital copies available only in the reading rooms rather than online, maintaining physical presence requirements even for materials that could technically be accessed remotely. This caution reflects the institution's ongoing commitment to controlling access, even as it opens more materials to research. Let's talk about what happened when the Pius XI archives actually opened in March 2020, because the reality of that opening illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of archival disclosure. The opening was announced with significant media attention and with expectations that researchers would quickly find definitive answers to the long-standing questions about Pius XII's conduct during the Holocaust. Scholars from around the world applied for access, and the Vatican's reading rooms were booked for months in advance. But the actual research process, as historians soon discovered, was slower and more complex than the public narrative suggested. The sheer volume of material meant that comprehensive research would take years or decades, not months. The organization of the collection, while improved from its earlier state, still reflected the Vatican's administrative structure and priorities, which meant that documents relevant to a particular research question might be scattered across multiple series that had to be requested and consulted separately. And the finding aids, while helpful, were not complete or comprehensive, which meant that researchers still had to know what they were looking for, or had to spend extensive time browsing through materials in hopes of finding relevant documents. This was not the dramatic revelation that popular imagination expected. It was the beginning of a long process of scholarly examination that would gradually refine and complicate our understanding of Vatican policy during World War II. Early findings from the opened archives, reported in scholarly journals and conference presentations in 2020 and 2021, began to confirm what many historians had already argued based on the incomplete record, that the Vatican had extensive knowledge of Nazi atrocities. The Pius XII had received detailed reports about persecution and deportation of Jews, and that his public statements remained in general terms rather than specific denunciations. But the documents also revealed new details about the Vatican's diplomatic activities, about specific interventions on behalf of individuals and communities, about the difficult strategic calculations involved in maintaining neutrality while trying to provide humanitarian assistance, and about the internal tensions within the Vatican bureaucracy as different officials advocated for different approaches. These findings didn't resolve the fundamental moral question about whether Pius XII should have spoken more forcefully or acted differently, because that question involves judgments about what was possible and what would have been effective given the constraints and risks of the situation. Judgments that historians will continue to debate regardless of documentary evidence. But the findings did provide a richer and more nuanced evidentiary basis for those debates, moving the conversation beyond the polarized positions that had dominated for decades. Now here's the question that brings us back to the 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat. Did that document appear in the materials that were opened in 2020? This is where the story becomes somewhat uncertain, because tracking a specific document through decades of archival management and then through the opening process requires either access to internal Vatican records about classification and declassification decisions or very detailed research in the opened collection itself. As of the current date, there's no public scholarly report that specifically identifies and discusses a memorandum matching the description we've been following, which could mean several things. It could mean that the document was indeed opened in 2020, but hasn't yet been discovered by researchers who are working through an enormous collection with limited time and resources. It could mean that the document was reclassified or recatalogued in a way that makes it difficult to locate without knowing exactly where to look. It could mean that the document remains restricted even within the opened Pius Iphonin collection, held back for reasons that weren't explained in the general opening announcement. Or it could mean that the document no longer exists in identifiable form, having been damaged, lost, or somehow removed from the collection at some point during the decades of storage and reorganization. All of these possibilities are consistent with what we know about how the Vatican archives function, and all of them illustrate the ongoing challenges of archival research in institutional contexts where access is controlled and where the full scope of the collection is never completely transparent. The broader significance of the Pius XIII archive opening goes beyond any single document. It represents a shift in the Vatican's approach to its own history, a recognition that the institution cannot maintain the kind of archival control that was possible in earlier eras, that social and political pressures for transparency are sufficiently strong that the Vatican has to engage with them, even if that engagement involves risks and uncertainties. But it's also important to recognize that this shift is partial and limited. The Vatican opened the materials from Pius XII's pontificate, but materials from later periods, from John XXIII, Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, remain largely inaccessible under the standard timeline. Materials in the archives of specific congregations and offices may not have been included in the Pius XIII opening if they were classified separately or if they were determined to fall outside the scope of that particular archival release. And the Vatican retains the authority to restrict specific items even within opened collections if there are compelling reasons to do so, reasons that the institution determines without necessarily explaining them publicly. The secrets beneath the Vatican continue to exist. In other words, even as more materials become accessible, because the structure of secrecy is built into the institutional systems rather than being dependent on any particular set of hidden documents. Let's consider one final aspect of how the 1937 memorandum, whether or not it's now accessible, shaped the historical understanding of Vatican policy. The absence of such internal strategic documents from the accessible record for decades meant that historians developed interpretations based on the materials they could consult. Public statements, diplomatic correspondence, memoirs, and the curated selection in the Acte et Documents. Those interpretations emphasized either Vatican concern and action in sympathetic accounts, or Vatican silence and inaction in critical accounts. But both types of interpretation treated Vatican policy as more unified and more certain than it probably was. Institutions making difficult decisions under extreme pressure rarely achieve perfect unity or complete certainty, and the documentary record of such institutions, if it's complete, usually shows debate, disagreement, revision, and doubt, alongside whatever decision ultimately emerges. The strategic memorandum about the Concordat would have shown that kind of complexity, would have revealed Vatican officials in 1937 questioning their own diplomatic strategy and analyzing its limitations, and that revelation would have complicated both the defensive narrative that Pius XIV was confidently pursuing the best available strategy and the critical narrative that he was indifferent or complicit. The document's absence allowed both narratives to be simpler than they should have been, and its potential presence in the now accessible archives, if it has indeed been opened, creates an opportunity for more historically grounded and more nuanced understanding of how the Vatican actually functioned during one of the most morally demanding periods in modern history. You're still here, which tells me you understand that this isn't really about one document. It's about how institutions manage knowledge across generations, how they decide what becomes history and what remains administrative memory, how they use time itself as a tool for controlling narrative. We're in the present now, or close to it, looking back at a century of archival practice that stretches from the 1939 removal of that memorandum through the 2020 opening of the Pius XII archives and into whatever comes next. And what comes next is shaped not just by Vatican decisions, but by changes in how archives work globally, by technology that makes information harder to contain, by expectations about transparency that are fundamentally different from the expectations that existed when Eugenio Pacelli became Pope and ordered the reorganization of his Secretariat of State's files. The contemporary Vatican archives, renamed in 2019 from the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum to the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum, from the Vatican Secret Archives to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, precisely to move away from associations with secrecy, now face challenges that earlier generations of archivists and church officials didn't have to manage. Researchers expect digital access, expect searchable databases and online finding aids, expect timely responses to access requests, and clear explanations when materials are restricted. These expectations clash with the Vatican's traditional model of controlled physical access and careful, slow disclosure of sensitive materials. The Vatican has responded by modernizing some of its practices, improving its catalog systems, digitizing selected materials, training archival staff in contemporary preservation and access methods. But it has also maintained core aspects of its restrictive approach, including the requirement that researchers work in Rome under supervised conditions, the limitation on photographing or copying certain materials, and the continued practice of restricting access to materials from recent decades regardless of what those materials contain. This tension between modernization and control defines the current state of the Vatican archives and will shape their evolution over the coming years. Let's talk about a specific example of how digital technology is changing the dynamics of archival control, because this is crucial to understanding what might happen to documents like the 1937 memorandum in the future. In 2012, a project called the Vatican Secret Archives Digitization Initiative was launched in partnership with a private company to digitize significant portions of the archive's holdings. The project was ambitious, aiming to create high-resolution digital copies of millions of pages of documents, and it was funded privately rather than by the Vatican itself, which meant that a for-profit entity gained access to materials that had previously been tightly controlled by church authorities. The arrangement included provisions about who would own the digital copies and how they would be made available. The Vatican retained ownership and control, but the private company was given rights to sell access to the digitized materials through a subscription service, which created a commercial market for Vatican archival content. This commercialization has been controversial among scholars who argue that archival materials of such historical importance should be freely available rather than monetized. But from the Vatican's perspective, the arrangement provided resources for preservation and digitization that the Church itself couldn't afford, while maintaining Vatican control over what was digitized and how the digital copies were used. The broader implications of digitization go beyond commerce. Once a document has been digitized, multiple copies of that digital file can exist on different servers in different institutional and national contexts, and controlling the distribution of those copies becomes exponentially more difficult than controlling access to a physical document in a locked archive. This is why the Vatican has been selective about what it digitizes, and even more selective about what digitized materials it makes available online versus available only in its reading rooms. A document that exists only in physical form in Vatican storage can be accessed only by researchers who travel to Rome, who gain permission, who work under supervision. A document that exists in digital form and is made available online can be accessed by anyone, anywhere. can be downloaded and shared and analyzed using computational methods, can become part of global historical consciousness in ways that the Vatican can't manage or contain. This shift from physical to digital fundamentally changes the power relationship between the archive and its users, and institutions like the Vatican that are accustomed to controlling access through physical and procedural barriers are still figuring out how to navigate this new environment. The 1937 memorandum, if it still exists and if it was part of the materials opened in 2020, may or may not have been digitized. The Vatican's digitization priorities have focused on materials that are most frequently requested by researchers, on materials that are in fragile condition and need digital surrogates to reduce handling of originals, and on materials that have particular historical or cultural significance. A memorandum about internal Vatican debate over the Reich Concordat would potentially fit all three categories. It would be of intense interest to scholars working on Vatican policy during the Nazi period. It might be in fragile condition after decades of storage, and it would have significant historical importance for understanding how the Church approached its relationship with totalitarian regimes. But whether Vatican archivists would prioritize it for digitization depends on whether they recognize its significance and whether they want to make it readily accessible. And those decisions are made internally according to criteria that aren't always transparent to outside researchers. Let's consider what would happen if a document like the 1937 memorandum were discovered and published by a researcher working in the opened Pius XIII archives. The researcher would likely publish their findings in a scholarly journal or present them at an academic conference, would provide transcription or translation of the key passages, would analyze the document's significance for understanding Vatican policy, and would contextualize it within the broader documentary record. That publication would then be picked up by other scholars, would be cited in subsequent research, would potentially be reported in media outlets if the findings were seen as sufficiently newsworthy, and would gradually become part of the established historiography of the Vatican's wartime conduct. The document itself, having been discovered by scholarship, would cease to be secret in any meaningful sense. Its content would be known, its implications would be debated, and it would no longer be possible for anyone to pretend that the Vatican hadn't engaged in internal debate about the effectiveness of its diplomatic strategies in the 1930s. This process of scholarly disclosure is how archival secrets eventually become historical knowledge, and it's a process that the Vatican facilitates by opening archives, but can't fully control once the materials are accessible to researchers who are independent of church authority and who publish in venues that the Vatican doesn't oversee. But here's the complication. Even after the Pius XIII archives were opened, even after researchers began working through the materials, the Vatican retained control over certain aspects of access and interpretation that shape how documents become historical knowledge. Researchers working in the Vatican archives operate under rules that limit how much they can photograph or copy in a given day, that restrict their ability to share images of documents with colleagues before publication, and that require them to work with physical or digital materials only in the Vatican's reading rooms, rather than being able to work with copies in their home institutions. These restrictions slow the research process and limit collaboration, which means that important documents might be seen by only a few researchers initially and might not receive broader scholarly attention for months or years after they're first consulted. The Vatican also retains the authority to withdraw access to materials if they determine that a researcher has violated the rules of use, or if they decide that certain materials were opened in error and need to be reclassified. This has happened rarely, but the fact that it's possible creates uncertainty and affects how researchers approach their work in the archives, knowing that access is a privilege that can be revoked rather than a right that they can depend on. The institutional culture of the Vatican archives, shaped by centuries of tradition and by the Church's understanding of its role as guardian of its own history, continues to emphasize discretion and caution, even as the archives become more open. The archivists who work there are professionals who understand modern archival standards and who recognize the importance of providing access to researchers, but they're also employees of the Church who understand their work as serving the institution's mission and interests. This dual commitment to professional archival practice and to institutional loyalty means that decisions about what to preserve, how to catalog, what to make accessible, and how to interpret access rules are always made with awareness of their implications for the Church's reputation and authority. This isn't corruption or dishonesty. It's the natural operation of an institutional archive that serves an institution first and serves the broader scholarly community and the public second. Understanding this hierarchy of loyalties is essential to understanding both what the Vatican archives have achieved in terms of preservation and access and what their limitations are as sources for historical research that seeks to examine the Church critically or to hold it accountable for past actions. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the Vatican's archival practices constitute a form of censorship or whether they simply represent the normal operations of a private institution managing its own records. The distinction matters because it affects how we judge the Church's conduct and how we understand the ethical obligations of institutions with significant historical collections. If the Vatican archives were a public repository, fully funded by taxpayers and created to serve the public interest, then the restrictions and the careful management of access would clearly be problematic censorship that violated principles of transparency and accountability. But the Vatican archives are not a public repository. They're the internal records of a sovereign entity, the Holy See, and that entity has no legal obligation to provide access to anyone. The fact that the Vatican has chosen to provide access to scholars, even with restrictions and limitations, is a choice that it could revoke entirely if it wanted to. This reality creates an uncomfortable position for historians who depend on Vatican archival materials for their research, but who also want to critique Vatican conduct based on what they find in those materials. They are, in effect, guests in an institutional space, working with materials that they're allowed to see, but that they have no legal or moral right to demand access to. And that position of dependence affects what they can say and how they can say it, sometimes subtly and sometimes more directly. The future of Vatican archival access will be shaped by several factors that are still unfolding. One is demographic. The generation of Church officials who lived through World War II and the immediate post-war period, who had personal stakes in defending the Church's conduct during the era, are now gone, and younger officials may feel less need to protect institutional reputation regarding events from 80 or 90 years ago. This generational shift could lead to greater openness as the emotional and political urgency of the controversies fades. Another factor is technological. As digitization becomes more common and more expected, the Vatican will face increasing pressure to make materials available online rather than only in Roman reading rooms. And resisting that pressure will become more difficult as other major archives around the world move toward digital access. A third factor is institutional. The Catholic Church itself is changing, facing challenges to its authority and relevance in many parts of the world, and its approach to transparency and accountability is evolving as part of its response to those challenges. The archival openness that we've seen in recent years regarding materials from Pius XII's pontificate may be a model for how the Church will handle future openings, or it may be an exception driven by the particular intensity of the controversies surrounding that papacy. We won't know which until we see how the Vatican handles access to materials from subsequent pontificates, particularly from the John Paul II era, which involved its own controversies and its own questions about church conduct that future historians will want to examine. The 1937 memorandum about the Reich Concordat, whether it survives in accessible form or whether it has been lost to time and bureaucracy, represents a particular moment in the history of Vatican archival practice, a moment when the institution recognized that certain kinds of internal debate and strategic doubt needed to be protected from external scrutiny, and when it had the systems and the authority to make that protection effective. That moment is passing, not because the Vatican has abandoned its commitment to controlling its historical narrative, but because the technological, social, and political contexts in which archives operate have changed in ways that make absolute control less possible. Documents that were hidden effectively in 1939 by being reclassified and moved to restricted storage can't be hidden as effectively in 2025 because the expectations about access are different, because researchers have more tools for discovering what's missing from the accessible record, and because the reputational costs of maintaining secrecy often outweigh whatever benefits the secrecy was meant to provide. This shift doesn't mean that all secrets will be revealed or that the Vatican will become fully transparent about its history, but it does mean that the nature of secrecy is changing, becoming more about delay and management than about permanent concealment, becoming more about framing and interpretation than about simple hiding of uncomfortable truths. You've stayed through the entire journey, and that means you've seen something that most people never examine carefully: how silence works across decades, how institutions with centuries of practice can shape historical memory not through dramatic acts of suppression, but through the patient, procedural management of access to their own records. We've followed one document, or the idea of one document, from its creation in 1937 through its removal from accessible archives in 1939, through decades of storage and reclassification, through the eventual opening of the Pius XIII materials in 2020, and into the uncertain present where we still don't know definitively whether that document exists in recoverable form or what it would tell us if we could read it today. But the real story isn't about that single memorandum. The real story is about the systems that allowed it to disappear from the historical record for so long, about what those systems tell us regarding how powerful institutions manage uncomfortable knowledge, and about what changes and what stays the same as those institutions adapt to new expectations and new technologies. Let's bring this to a conclusion by thinking about what we've actually learned through this examination. What concrete insights we can take from following the thread of one classified document through the labyrinth of Vatican archival practice. First, we've learned that secrecy in sophisticated institutions isn't primarily about locked doors and forbidden chambers. It's about classification systems, catalog structures, access procedures, and storage locations that determine what can be found and what remains invisible even when it's technically preserved. The Vatican's secret archives, now the Apostolic Archives, have never been secret in the sense of being completely closed or completely hidden. They've been secret in the sense of being carefully managed, with visibility controlled through procedures that require researchers to already know what they're looking for before they can request it, and with entire categories of materials kept out of the accessible catalogs, so that even diligent researchers wouldn't encounter them unless they had inside knowledge of what existed. This is a much more effective form of secrecy than dramatic concealment because it doesn't attract attention, doesn't invite the kind of speculation and legend building that surrounds supposedly hidden chambers and forbidden manuscripts, and doesn't require constant active effort to maintain once the classification and storage systems are in place. They operate automatically through the normal routines of archival work. Second, we've learned that documents removed from archives in one historical moment don't necessarily stay removed forever, but their path back to accessibility is shaped by institutional priorities and by external pressures that the institution has to respond to. The 1937 memorandum was removed because it complicated the narrative that the Vatican was developing about its relationship with Nazi Germany, because it showed internal doubt and debate at a moment when the institution needed to present unified purpose and consistent policy. That removal made sense from the Vatican's perspective in 1939, when Pius X was just beginning his papacy, and when the strategic considerations discussed in the memorandum were still relevant to active diplomatic relationships. But 80 years later, with all the participants dead, with the historical context completely changed, with multiple generations of scholarship having examined Vatican conduct from every available angle, the reasons for keeping the document restricted have largely evaporated. If the document has been reclassified and made accessible as part of the Pius XIII archive opening, it's because Vatican officials conducting the review process for that opening recognized that continuing to restrict it would create more problems than releasing it, that the reputational risks of continued secrecy outweighed whatever discomfort the document's contents might cause. This dynamic, where time and changing context eventually make previously sensitive materials less threatening, is how most archival secrets eventually get resolved, not through dramatic exposure, but through gradual and often quiet declassification. Third, we've learned that the absence of documents from the accessible historical record has real consequences for how history gets written and understood, consequences that persist even after the documents eventually become available. The decades during which the 1937 memorandum and similar materials were inaccessible were decades during which historians formed interpretations, published books and articles, trained students, and established frameworks of understanding that became entrenched in the scholarly literature. When new documents eventually surface that complicate or challenge those established interpretations, they don't automatically overturn the existing historiography. They get incorporated into it gradually, as new scholars take them into account and as established scholars revise their positions or defend their original arguments against the new evidence. This means that the effects of archival restriction extend far beyond the period of restriction itself, shaping historical understanding for generations after the restricted materials are finally opened. Vatican Mysteries, in the scholarly sense, aren't primarily about what's still hidden. They're about what was hidden for so long that our historical understanding developed without it, creating blind spots and distortions that are difficult to correct even when better evidence becomes available. Fourth, we've learned something about the particular challenges of studying institutions that control their own historical records and that have strong incentives to manage how their history is understood. The Vatican is an extreme example because of its antiquity, its continuity, its sovereignty, and its religious mission, but the underlying dynamics apply to any institution that maintains archives of its own activities. Governments, corporations, universities, and other large organizations all face similar tensions between preserving their records for historical purposes and protecting themselves from reputational damage or legal liability that might result from complete transparency about their decision-making processes and their internal operations. The difference is that most of these institutions eventually face external pressures that force disclosure. Government archives are subject to freedom of information laws. Corporate records get discovered through litigation. University papers get donated to public repositories. The Vatican, as a sovereign entity with no higher authority to compel disclosure, has been able to maintain control over its archives to an exceptional degree and for an exceptional duration. Understanding how the Vatican has managed this control, what strategies and systems it has employed, provides insights into institutional self-protection more broadly and into the ways that powerful entities shape their own historical narratives. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the relationship between archives and historical truth is more complicated than simple models of disclosure and discovery suggest. It's tempting to think of archives as containing truth that's hidden and that will be revealed when the archives are opened, as if opening the locked door will immediately answer all the questions and resolve all the controversies. But the reality is that archives are themselves products of institutional processes that reflect particular priorities and perspectives, that documents are created and preserved selectively, that what ends up in archives is only a fraction of what happened historically, and that even complete access to all surviving documents wouldn't give us complete knowledge of past events and past decision-making. The Vatican archives, even if they were entirely open tomorrow, would still represent the Vatican's own record of its activities, filtered through the bureaucratic processes that created the documents, through the archival practices that preserved some materials and not others, through the classifications and organizations that shape how documents can be found and understood. This doesn't mean the archives are useless or that we can't learn important things from them, but it does mean we need to approach them with appropriate skepticism and with awareness that what we're seeing is one institution's documented memory of itself, not an objective record of historical reality. The document that was removed from the Vatican archives in 1939, whether it survives and whether we'll ever read its contents, stands for all the documents that institutions create in moments of doubt and debate. Documents that show complexity and uncertainty and internal disagreement. Documents that get removed or restricted because they complicate official narratives and make institutions look more human and more fallible than those institutions want to appear. Every government, every church, every large organization produces such documents, and every such organization has to decide what to do with them, whether to preserve them and risk future embarrassment, whether to destroy them and lose part of their own institutional memory, or whether to preserve them but control access in ways that allow the organization to maintain its preferred narrative while technically keeping the historical record intact. The Vatican chose the third option, and it did so with a sophistication and consistency that reflects centuries of experience managing information and managing its own history. Understanding that choice, understanding the systems that implement it, understanding both what those systems have preserved and what they've kept hidden. This is what it means to seriously examine the secrets beneath the Vatican, not as dramatic mysteries, but as institutional practices that shape historical knowledge and historical memory in ways that matter profoundly for how we understand the Catholic Church's role in the modern world. You've listened to this entire story, followed it from the beginning through 7 sections of detailed examination, and you now understand something real and specific about how archival control works in one of the world's most sophisticated and historically continuous institutions. You understand that the Vatican secrets aren't about buried treasure or forbidden knowledge, but about classification codes and storage locations, about the difference between documents that appear in accessible catalogs and documents that don't, about time, scales that span generations, and about institutional priorities that value control over complete transparency. You understand that one removed document from 1937 connects to patterns of archival practice that stretch across centuries and that continue to evolve in response to contemporary pressures for openness and accountability. And you understand that even now, even with major archive openings and with changing expectations about transparency, the relationship between the Vatican and its own history remains contested, remains shaped by institutional imperatives that prioritize the Church's mission and authority over the historian's desire for complete access and complete knowledge. If you found this exploration meaningful, if you've appreciated the careful attention to real details and real systems rather than vague mysteries and atmospheric speculation, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. It helps others find these stories. And it tells me that this approach, focusing on concrete information, on institutional mechanisms, on verifiable historical contexts, is what listeners value. And if you're not already subscribed to Tales of Vatican Secrets, please consider subscribing. New stories arrive every day, each one examining a different aspect of Vatican history, each one trying to move past the mythology and the sensationalism to understand how this institution actually works, how it has shaped history, and how it continues to shape our understanding of that history through its control over sources and evidence. This isn't the kind of content that trades in easy answers or dramatic revelations. It's the kind of content that respects your intelligence, that trusts you to engage with complexity, and that recognizes that the real stories about institutions and power are often more interesting than the legends. Thank you for staying with me through this long examination. Thank you for your attention, for your patience, for your willingness to follow a single thread through decades of archival history. The story of what happened to one document removed from the Vatican archives in 1939 is now yours. Not as a mystery solved, but as a window into how institutional memory works, how silence is constructed and maintained, and how the past becomes the history we're allowed to know.